I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
The chapter in Wiersbe's book that I wanted to talk about the most tonight is entitled Eating Toward Communion. And it's a meditation on, what it means to be in communion with the transcendent God, what it means to be in communion with something bigger and higher than yourself. And that means, first and foremost, getting out of our heads, which is easier said than done, for sure, especially in our modern world. It's easy to be stuck in our heads where, sort of like supporting ideas or thinking about ideas or kind of vibing with ideas and just churning ideas, listening to people talk about ideas and so on is like action, but it actually isn't. And, I should know this better than anybody because I kind of talk for a living. I literally do kind of talk and write for a living. So I deal with ideas all the time. But I'll tell you what, if those ideas lead to nothing more than people sort of vibing with those ideas and thinking those thoughts, I don't want to do this job. So, good advice for us all for a lot of reasons is to get out of our head. And that's what this chapter is about, the embodiment of ideas, the embodiment of a way of life, the embodiment actually, in the Christian case, of the transcendent God in Christ and then in ourselves and in the world. So getting out of our head is essential. And that's why Wiersbe says, quote, Jesus is not a Gnostic teacher who visits Earth to impart a few special body-despising teachings to a select few people. Rather, he is the eternally existent one who from the beginning has been at work ordering creation from the inside, making it an intelligible whole, capable of membership and life. And part of that is that natural law that we started out with. That ordering of creation from the inside is that natural law that we were talking about. The mind of the transcendent God puts this into the world, this order, which we then can be a part of. And that's what membership is about, the act of taking part of this. And as I say in the parentheses there, this is why, to a certain extent, the church went with Aristotle fairly early on more than with Plato, because Plato was, and you can go back, 2 years ago, and my summer seminar was about Plato. And then last year it was about Aristotle, right? And that's because both of those thinkers are so formative to Christian theology in the early years. But the reason why Aristotle became emphasized more is precisely because the Christian teaching is about the world. It's about the incarnation. It's about the idea or the logos coming into the world, not just the world reflecting that logos, but the logos coming into the world, which means that the world and everything in it is actually very important, and you can discern the moral law and the mind and heart of God in your observations of the world, in your participation of the world. So that's why Aristotle became more dominant in the development of Christian thought. Wiersbe writes, this way of speaking about Jesus suggests that it is a serious distortion to confine his ministry and his significance to the salvation of a selected individual post-mortem souls. Christian faith is not about one's escape from creaturely membership. It is instead the way by which one learns to love the members and the memberships of life as Christ did. So a lot of us have wanted to think that faith is about more or less selecting into that selected group of people, right? Which then saves us from damnation. And so the whole point is kind of to be in our heads, to literally change our mind, as though us deciding that we believe something is all we need to do. And that's the whole point of life. But if that was so, the world would not have been created in all of its complexity. Christ wouldn't have come into it and lived in it and embedded his very nature into it. So let's just say it's a little bit too narrow of a view to say that that's what it's about. We are embodied souls. The world is here for a reason. It's good because God made it. And so therefore, our membership, as he puts it, or our participation in it is very important. It's not something to kind of shuck aside in favor of, the one thing, which is sort of escaping this world and enjoying everlasting life in heaven, which is not to say that those things don't exist. It's just to say that that may not be the entire point of this whole adventure. So this brings Wiersbe to the issue of the table. As you know, if you read the Gospels, the New Testament, you know that Jesus spent a lot of time sharing the table with people, eating with people, going to festivities with people, chatting and talking with all kinds of people, with strangers, with outcasts, with people who are considered sinners, whether they were or not. And he broke a lot of rules. He openly defied the existing religious, gender, and racial prejudices of the day in his social life, which just should teach us that there was nobody and nothing that was beyond his esteem. He wasn't, just kind of weirdly modern phraseology, but he wasn't discriminating. He exemplifies the nature of God. And so, it's an inclusive nature, obviously. And so this was why the table was so important, because even to this day, eating is such an intimate thing, it seems like, eating with other people, right? When you do, it is because you're fairly comfortable with them. It's because you want to actually talk to them. I think it's a sign of some of our social problems right now that so many people eat alone all the time, and maybe even prefer to. But, at its best, it is a place where people can gather, enjoy the fruits of the earth, the fruits of their labor, and relax and share stories and share themselves. And this is what the table was when Jesus was there. So, and then, he raises the Last Supper, just the last occasion on which Jesus met with his disciples and shared a supper. And Wiersbe reminds us it was both a real supper, as in they were dining, and it was also the initiation of a practice, a sacrament that would continue his communing with people's bodily as well as their spiritual existence here. So he was both initiating something that they could continue onward as a sacrament, but he was also initiating or confirming a practice that had been going on in his circle for a long time, which is communing with people at the table. And those two ideas are very much mingled. And, so bread and wine, the things of the earth, grown and made with human hands, he initiated became the presence of God. And by doing this, he is at the very least emphasizing that he is embedded within the world, that he has made the world himself, that he has in fact made the world a sacred place. And that these elements can become sacred. And when people participate in them, they can come closer to him. So there's this mingling of the sacrament and the act of communion more generally, as in, people, friends, family, getting together, sharing a meal, loving each other. And I think that's got to be intentional. So, it's supposed to be something that brings people into togetherness and communion with each other, into mutual love. It shouldn't be a source of division, but oftentimes it is if we focus only on the sacrament and become over-focused. In this same thing, God blesses woman by coming into the world through a woman. God blesses food by coming into the world as food. So you see this entering into and passing through that in effect brings God in and through us and in and through the world, and makes them something that we ought to consider sacred, that we ought to be consider valuable enough to pay attention to. So as it says there, the sacrament was no doubt taught, but I think what some of us forgot was that Eucharistic table manners, as the author puts it, are also important. Using our food and table as the means of communion is what we in the modern world sometimes forget. So we don't necessarily mingle the two. The table should not be a place of division. And there's a couple of places in the book where he deals with layers of that thought. In the first one, he's dealing with Paul correcting the Corinthian Christians. And I want to read that to you. This is on page 201, where he says, Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth demonstrates that Christ's followers could fail to eat Eucharistically. Quote, I hear that there are divisions among you. When you come together to eat, it is not really the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. On other occasions, people ate in an inconsiderate manner, eating food, particularly meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods, that bothered another one's conscience and caused them to, quote, stumble in the faith. Paul is clearly worried that in their eating, the Corinthians are not bearing witness to the presence of Christ among them. People who claim to be followers of Christ were failing to, quote, discern the body, which means that they were eating and drinking in ways that brought division and harm to membership. So that whole paragraph speaks to the ways in which simply dining together was the important practice in the early Christian church, and how they did it really mattered. So if they were arguing about, what could be eaten and what couldn't be eaten, or if they were just sort of going through the motions, but then just basically going back and eating with their families or eating alone and not being neighborly with their approach, then they were not really practicing the Lord's Supper. So, we'll have to think about what that means for us in our daily lives, but it has to mean more than the sacrament and the church. That's very important if you're a Christian, but it can't be everything. Then the other example is Peter had to be told by God 3 times to loosen up about his own dietary restrictions in favor of love and neighborliness at the table. And this is on page 221. Wiersbe writes, this temptation was at the heart of the early Christian community. It was revealed in the tension over the welcome of the Gentile believer Cornelius. As Acts described him, Cornelius was an Italian God-fearer. The crucial test for the church community was whether or not he would be welcomed into their membership. In a vision, a sign that prophetic subjectivity is potentially underway, God instructed Cornelius to send men to Peter so that he might come to meet with Cornelius. While these men were sent, God also gave a vision to Peter, a vision in which he saw, quote, the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. The voice said to him again, a second time, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up into heaven. So I guess after the 3rd time, Peter learned his lesson that communion was more important than scruples when it came to exactly what to eat. And we could apply that lesson to scruples about just about anything. So this was the importance of neighborliness, love, and communion with other people, that the dietary restriction should be altered.
I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class. But today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.